What's going on, everyone? In this video, we're going to be going step by step through the assembly of the Vanquish VS4-10 chassis and transmission included in the VS4-10 Origin Limited kit. This will take you from page 8 to 11 of the included manual. For these steps, we're going to need bags C1, D1, D2, and then we need a couple of items that are not included. One of those is going to be your servo of choice, a standard 10th scale style servo, and a servo horn. The Vanquish 20mm servo horn is recommended for length and clearance, but all servos vary, so you may have to change the servo horn depending on the servo you're using. I'll be using a Futaba S9177 SV servo. For this, I'll be using the Vanquish VPS0-2412. That is a 25 tooth spline and a 20mm length servo horn. The chassis mounted servo and servo winch bracket has a Vanquish logo on the front side of it. This will give you an indication of what direction you need to point your servo horn. With the servo horn pre-installed on the servo and in this orientation when in the neutral position, install the servo into the servo mount. Retain the servo in place with the larger head 3mm by 10mm length screws. You can see here that the servo does install from the top down onto the servo mounting plate. The servo does not install from the bottom up. Also, there's 4 extra of the large servo mounting screws included in the kit in case you want to mount a servo winch. For the next step, we need to start with the driver's side frame rail. The driver's side frame rail can be noted by the Vanquish logo on the left side of the closed face of the chassis rails. Before we start the assembly of the chassis, note that almost this entire next couple of steps use M3 by 10 screws, except for 2 M3 by 8 screws that get used on the passenger side. So make sure you find those 2 shorter screws and set those aside. We're going to begin by attaching the aluminum panhard mount that is included in the die cut foam. Using one of the M3 by 10 screws, we're going to begin by attaching it to the chassis near the front of the arch. Then we're going to attach one of the shock towers. Note that the shock tower for the front driver's side uses the shock tower with the body mount hole towards the rear of the chassis. The shock towers are attached to the chassis with M3 by 10 countersunk screws. With the panhard mount and shock tower now in place, we're going to attach the battery tray mount. The image in the manual is looking at the part from this direction. Take note of the width of the part next to the large opening in the center of the part. Attach the electronics tray mount to the chassis with the M3 by 10mm screws. Moving rearward along the chassis, now we're going to install the skid plate into the chassis. The transmission mount side is what will go towards the driver's side of the vehicle. Attach the skid plate to the chassis with 2 of the M3 by 10 screws. We can now install the rear chassis brace into the vehicle. This chassis brace is asymmetrical, so the larger opening is towards the rear of the brace. 2 more M3 by 10 screws attach this to the chassis. Lastly, we can install the other shock tower from the pair of shock towers that we took out earlier. M3 by 10 flathead screws again attach this to the chassis. We can now remove the passenger side frame rail from the die cut foam and begin to install it onto our chassis. To begin this side, let's first install those 2 shorter M3 by 8 screws that we discussed earlier. They go in the 2 screw locations towards the front of the wheel arch. Moving again from front to rear, we can next install the other shock tower. Make sure that the body post mounting location is a mirror of the one on the driver's side. Use the M3 by 10 flathead screws to attach this shock tower to the chassis. Attach the remaining battery and electronics tray mount to the chassis with the M3 by 10 screws. Next, we need to continue to secure the skid plate to the chassis with the M3 by 10 screws. Make sure that it is noted which screw hole locations are used to attach the skid plate to the chassis in this step. Continue mounting the rear cross brace and shock towers to the chassis just like we did on the driver's side. Again, make sure to note that the shock tower needs to go in the rearward position of the chassis to make sure that everything lines up properly. Again, make sure that you've used the correct shock towers in each of the orientations to make sure that the body post holes are in the correct spot. They should all be towards the middle of the chassis. Next, we're ready to attach the body posts to the chassis. You'll find the body post tree in the parts bag. The front body posts are included in the center underneath of the trussed rear body post. And for the included origin body, we are going to use the large X-brace tall rear body posts. For the front, note that in the instructions it shows that 3.5 holes roughly will be exposed above the top of the shock tower. This is where you want to slide the body post into and then retain it in position with the set pin. For the rear, 2.5 holes should be exposed above the shock tower before you install the set pin. Now we're going to open up bag D1 and D2. To begin this step, we're going to insert the M 1.5 by 8 pin into the top shaft. The pin will go in the hole furthest away from the threads on the top shaft. We'll then take the idler gear, which has slots for this 1.5 millimeter pin on the back side, and slide it onto the shaft from the threaded side. The gear should seat over top of that 1.5 millimeter pin. Then take the 5 by 10 millimeter bearings and slide them on either side of that top gear. Next, we can grab our idler gear. The two 5 by 11 bearings go on either side of the gear. And lastly, the lightened steel idler gear pin can go through that idler gear. Next, we'll take the final drive gear and the transmission outputs. The transmission outputs look very similar, however, one side is threaded and one side is not. Make sure that when you put these outputs onto the final gear and when you begin to attach them, that you attach the screw through the non-threaded side into the threaded side. Use the M2x6 hardware to attach the outputs to the final gear. Make sure that you have a small amount of thread lock on the hardware before attaching it. With all three of those screws in place, we can install the 8 by 16 by 5 millimeter bearings on each side of the final gear. Now remove the aluminum transmission halves from the die-cut foam. Install the top shaft through the transmission half first, followed by the idler gear. Before installing the final gear into the transmission, apply a light coat of grease to the teeth. The gears in this transmission are heat-treated steel and they do need to be greased to ensure longevity. You can rotate the gears to make sure that the grease transfers nicely to all of them inside the transmission housing. Then we'll install the second half of the transmission case onto the first half. Next, remove the motor plate from the die-cut foam and place it over the top shaft of the transmission. Using the 25 millimeter long hardware with a very small amount of Loctite, attach the motor plate through the transmission halves. With the motor plate installed, you can spin the top shaft to make sure everything spins smoothly. Now, slide the included spacer over the top shaft first, and then install the M2x10 pin into the top shaft. Now install the slipper eliminator onto the top shaft and secure it in place with the M4 lock nut. If you cannot securely hold the spur gear mount tight enough to tighten this lock nut down, you can slide an Allen wrench into the lower output to keep it from spinning. Now install the 54-tooth 32-pitch spur gear onto the spur gear mount. With the included M3x6 hardware, mount the spur gear to the slipper eliminator with 3 screws that are evenly spaced. Place the gear guard onto the motor mount and hold it in place with the M3x12 hardware. For installation of the motor, these countersunk washers are provided for extra security. Just loosely tighten the motor screws onto the motor plate. If installing a brushless motor, I do suggest paying attention to the location of your motor wires. Keeping them pointed upwards allows for the easiest installation into the chassis. A 13-tooth 32-pitch pinion is included with the kit. Using a very small amount of thread lock, attach the pinion to the motor shaft. When installing the pinion onto the motor shaft, make sure that the full width portion of teeth of the pinion matches up and completely covers the 32-pitch spur gear. There's many methods to setting your gear mesh. A lot of us can set them by feel, but if you have not set it before, you can use a piece of paper between the teeth of the spur gear and the pinion, pressing it in lightly and then tightening the screws. I do suggest checking the gear mesh in several locations around the outside of the spur gear just to make sure that everything is looking good. There should be just a very small amount of movement between the spur gear and the pinion. Too much movement and you'll risk stripping the spur gear. Not enough movement and you'll put too much stress on the motor and risk overheating. There are 2 different length female drive shafts included in this bag. You will need to attach the shorter version to the output on the pinion and spur side of the transmission. Make sure to apply some thread lock to the threaded portion of the set pin when installing the drive shaft. The longer female portion of the drive shaft goes towards the motor side of the transmission. Again, make sure to use thread lock on the threaded portion of the set pin. This transmission spacer is included in the bag. Place it into the chassis first. The side with the bosses around the holes is what goes down and keys into the skid plate. Apply a small amount of thread lock to the M3x12 flathead screws and attach the transmission to the chassis assembly. And that completes this portion of the chassis and transmission assembly for the VS4-10 Origin.